So, roughly 13 years ago, my brother became an atheist. We were brought up non denominational, evangelical Christians, so this came as quite a shock, as you might imagine. Now, I actually went through my own period of doubt right after high school, but I got over it pretty quickly. Like, I personally doubted whether or not Jesus actually existed, but I had those doubts overcome pretty quickly when I learned that Jesus was actually mentioned by non Christian historians like Josephus. So, after I learned that he became an atheist, I thought I could overcome his doubts pretty easily, but I was wrong. I was very, very wrong. What's up, everyone? Cam here. In this video, I'm telling you the story of how after 10 years of study, I no longer take atheism seriously. Now, I started this video telling you about my brother, and that's all very relevant to where I'm at now. I used to take atheism very, very seriously. But pretty much the only thing I knew about atheism back then was that a lot of really smart, like, scientists were atheists, right? I had heard the name Richard Dawkins, but I didn't know what he actually said about religion. I just knew that really smart people were atheists. But let's return to the story, okay? After I learned that my brother became an atheist, I decided I was going to meet with him and, like, crush all of his objections, okay? This ended up being, like, the worst idea that I could have come up with. My brother and I met, and it turned out to be literally like one of the worst nights of my life. He raised objections to Christianity I had never even dreamt of, but that night showed me that I really had no clue why I believed in Christianity. So after that night, I started to look into the arguments for and against God's existence. I wanted to know whether or not God's existence was actually reasonable. And after just a few weeks of study, I quickly learned that there are very powerful arguments for God's existence. I found the Kalam cosmological argument, contingency arguments, teleological arguments from fine-tuning, arguments from consciousness, moral arguments, and so on. Like, there's actually a ton of arguments for the existence of God. Check out this video, got it linked right here, in which we lay out over 150 arguments for God's existence that show up in the literature. Now, this might lead you to think that this kind of like settles the matter. Like, don't all of these arguments for God's existence prove that atheism is unreasonable? Well, not so fast. Okay, first of all, every single argument has responses from atheists, and you've kind of got to do the work going through those responses. But secondly, there are also powerful arguments for atheism. Now, the best argument that atheists have, at least that I've found, is the problem of evil. The problem of evil is so powerful, in fact, that it's led a lot of people to say, look, okay, sure, you've got arguments for the existence of God, but the problem of evil is so powerful that it defeats all of those arguments. But you know what? I should probably like pause the story really quickly and just explain what this argument is, just a little bit more in depth, because somewhat counterintuitively, it actually plays a central role in why I no longer take atheism seriously. So first, let me say that this is one of the arguments I've paid the most attention to over the past decade. I've read books, I've watched debates between top scholars, I've listened to lectures, I've watched Joe Schmid, and so on. So to quickly summarize, the problem of evil is an argument against an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good God. Here's a really common way that it's expressed these days. Premise 1, if God exists, pointless suffering does not exist. Premise 2, pointless suffering exists. Therefore, 3, conclusion, God does not exist. Both premises in this argument seem pretty plausible. Like, if God did exist, he would probably not permit any pointless suffering. All suffering would have some kind of purpose. The Bible even says that God is working all things toward our good. So premise 1 seems pretty plausible. Premise 2 also seems pretty plausible. Like, just look around a bit and you'll find cases of seemingly pointless suffering. Now, as you might expect, just like atheists have responses to the arguments for God's existence, Christians have responses to both premises in the argument from evil. Some Christians argue that God can allow pointless suffering. Others argue that while some suffering might seem pointless on the surface, it still nevertheless has a purpose. But that's not what I'm doing in this video. Like, I wasn't convinced that atheism is silly because Christians have responses to these premises. The reason why I don't take atheism seriously any longer is because even if we accept the atheist's strongest argument, it still wouldn't prove atheism. And now I'm kind of realizing that I probably should have defined atheism a lot earlier on. Well, philosophically, atheism is the view that there are no gods. It's very simple. There's no creator, there's no designer of the universe. We weren't created for some purpose by somebody. Theism, on the other hand, is the view that at least one God exists. So atheism has no gods and theism has at least one God. But so why doesn't the problem of evil establish atheism? Well, simply because there are many other kinds of gods that it doesn't rule out. The British philosopher Philip Goff, he's a really good example of someone that adopts a sort of non-standard view of God.
So we're in this situation where the believers are tying themselves up in knots trying to explain suffering. The atheists are tying themselves up in knots trying to explain fine-tuning. When in fact, there are middle ground options that can elegantly account for both of these data points. Consider, for example, the hypothesis of a God of limited power. A God who's made the best universe they can. Maybe God simply can't create complex life in an instant. Maybe the only way God can create intelligent life is by creating a universe with the right physics that is eventually going to evolve intelligent life. And God's like, I'm sorry, I know it's going to be messy. This is all I can do, is this or nothing. I think this hypothesis can account for both the fine-tuning in terms of God's purposes and the suffering in terms of God's limitations.
So even though God is all good, perfectly benevolent on this view, given his limit in power, there's no way that he can stop all of the suffering in the world. What I want you to notice here, and this is really important, the problem of evil, which is once again, one of the atheists' best arguments, doesn't touch this particular view of God that we just went over. It doesn't touch it at all. Think about it like this. Okay, scientists used to believe that the speed of light was infinite. When we discovered evidence that the speed of light was finite instead of infinite, we didn't conclude that there's no such thing as light, right? We modified our concept of the speed of light, one of the properties of light. So what I'm saying here is that the best case scenario for the atheist in this argument should really just lead us to revise our view of God. It shouldn't lead us to become atheists. Keep in mind, I'm not saying that the problem of evil is sound or persuasive. Personally, I think there are many good responses to the problem of evil, like the soul-building theodicy. I'm saying that even if we grant it, hypothetically, if we grant it, it doesn't come anywhere close to even establishing atheism. Something else important I want you to notice is that the same cannot be said of arguments for God's existence. If we grant that the arguments go through for God's existence, then they would actually prove that at least one God is real. So the move that I'm making here by hypothetically granting their argument is not available to the atheists. They can't hypothetically grant the arguments for theism. Instead, they just sort of have to trust that every argument for God's existence fails, even the ones they've never heard of, which is actually kind of a giant leap of faith if you think about it. All right, now just so I'm not misunderstood, here's what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that Christians should think that God is limited in power. I'm not saying that we have to make this move, okay? What I'm saying is that the atheist's best argument doesn't come close to establishing atheism. Not even close. So even if we grant the atheist's strongest argument, it does not support atheism. The most it would do, again, hypothetically, is cause us to revise our view of God. That's it. And this is a huge reason why I no longer take atheism seriously. I should also mention that this is just one reason why I no longer take atheism seriously. If you'd like to see more reasons, check out my recent live stream with David Wood, where we break down Alex O'Connor's embarrassing debate against Cliff Netchtel. So it appears that David Wood and I are actually in complete agreement on this, which is pretty cool. Oh, and then Christianity is true.